The earliest time in my life that I can remember experiencing what leftovers were happened when I was probably 5 or 6. Both of my older brothers still lived at home with my mother and father and me. My next oldest brother is 10 years older than me, so they were quite a bit older than me at the time. And my mother was making homemade pizza for the first time that I had seen. And she bought 2 cans of that pre-made pizza dough, the kind that you roll out. And she was going to use both of them in this pan. But as she rolled that out into this baking dish, the dough was too big. And so the dough kind of came up on all the sides of the baking dish. And so it was about 2 inches high. And because there was now this well of crust, she filled this dish up with sauce, cheese, and meat. And I mean, she filled it up. It became like this pizza casserole by the end. And this was also my birthday dinner at the time. So when it came out of the oven, it was huge. Huge. She portioned out these very big squares of pizza to everybody. And mine even had a candle in it. And we all ate this huge piece of pizza that was incredibly filling. One of my brothers had a second piece, but the rest of us, one was plenty big enough. And that left 2 slices left over in the fridge. Now, I'm sure my parents assumed that they would enjoy those 2 slices for lunch the next day. But like I said, there were 2 teenagers in the house, so they were used to food just going missing. But this time it wasn't them. That next morning, long before anybody else woke up, I had only one thing on my mind. And that was having another slice of that amazing pizza. So I opened the fridge, I pulled out the dish, and I carefully put a slice on the plate. And I didn't really know how to use a microwave, so I just ate it cold, and it was fantastic. And one of my older brothers got up, saw me smiling, sitting at the table, eating a piece of that pizza, and thought, oh, crud, there's only one left. And grabbed it himself. And we both just sat there, eating pizza, cold, like 6:30 in the morning. And it was fantastic. And that is a lifelong memory for me, all thanks to my mom's pizza. As an adult, leftovers have been a constant thing at my in-laws' house. There has never been a family meal where Greg didn't cook enough meat for the whole block, and where Tina didn't help us pack up several containers worth of food to take home the next day. Or in the case of Thanksgiving, for the next 4 or 5 days, however long turkey lasts. Usually chance it on that last day, but it's worth it, right? For most of our marriage, I was the main cook in our house. But as we've had children and our schedules have changed, Deidre now is making most of the meals. And even though she knows exactly how much food to make for all the mouths that are going to be consuming this food, there's always usually just enough left over for her lunch the next morning. And if I've been nice, for me too. There's some people out there who don't like leftovers. These people are called Looney Tunes. And yes, I know some of you are in this room, but I said what I said, and I will fight you. There is something almost spiritual about leftovers. So much food is better the next day. Cold pizza, cold turkey sandwiches, reheated lasagna, on and on, always surprisingly better than the night before. And enjoying it takes you away from everything else for a moment. But what makes leftovers so much different than the meal that they came from? Quite a lot, actually, yeah. And that is what we're going to talk about today. What makes mom's leftovers something special? This doesn't seem like a heavily spiritual topic, but stick with me. Number 1, leftovers are made with specific people in mind. Why does mom make too much food? Because she loves you, she cares for you, and she wants to make sure you have plenty to eat. She wants to provide for her family, and this becomes more apparent the older the kids get and the rarer family dinners get. Suddenly, every family dinner is a feast because it becomes a special occasion. So maybe when you were kids like me, leftovers were kind of a rare thing. Sometimes it's because times are tight and the budget demands it. Often it's because you have another meal already planned for the next night. Shopping's already been done. You are being provided for either way. This is a similar mindset to what God had in the Old Testament when he was leading the Israelites through the desert. Woo! Big topic change. Stick with me. They had been grumbling in that desert ever since leaving Egypt, because at least they had enough to eat there. Now, they're wandering around in the hot sand, praying that a bug will fly in their mouth so they'll have some protein. Exodus 16, we're going to be reading verses 4 and 5. Read along with me. Then the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. The people are going to go out each day and gather enough for that day. This way I will test them to see whether or not they will follow my instructions. And on the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So God was saying that he would provide for his people and that they must follow his instructions. Eat what I provide that day and save no leftovers, except for on the 6th day. Take up enough for 2 days and save a day's worth of leftovers for the Sabbath. And even when that wasn't enough and they still complained, he sent them quail to eat. The tone of this story is very clear. God is testing them and he is often frustrated. And the Israelites are grateful for all of 2 minutes before they find another thing to complain about. Sounds like raising kids. And it doesn't matter how many times my son complains about life or how frustrating his attitude can be at times, it will never cause me to not want to provide for him, to feed him, to care for him. And in the same manner, God provided for the Israelites every morning, whether they were complaining or not. And they often were. There was always more than enough for them to eat their fill, because if there wasn't, God wouldn't have had to tell them not to gather extra. And twice as much for the Sabbath. And even though the leftovers weren't meant to be kept, he still made them to show his people that should the need arise, he would never let them go hungry. They would always be provided for in abundance. Number 2, leftovers are made to show the cook's provision. So sliding in from the end of that point to this one, like I said, my in-laws were all about leftovers. Most major holidays, we knew we were coming home with leftovers. And as those leftovers started getting bigger and more abundant, we were wise enough to at least start to bring over some of our own Tupperware because theirs would run out. It's almost a point of pride to send so much food off to our respective homes, but it always causes the memory that we had to last longer. Think about when you go out to a restaurant. Now, occasionally you will go to a very expensive, very fancy restaurant and you will pay an extravagant amount of money for a little portion of something that is incredibly delicious, but maybe not enough to even fill you up. Those are cool experiences, but they are rarely your favorite place to eat. Instead, most of our go-to restaurants are places where the same price or less will get us a whole mess of food, a giant plate that you might as well go ahead and cut in half and put in a box before you even begin, because you know you won't be able to finish it. Those places, there's just something about them beyond the value. You feel love in that kind of food, and you always take that to-go box home. You never leave it on the table to be thrown away. In 2 Kings 4, we see several quick hits from Elisha the Prophet as he ministered to people in his journeys. So in verses 42 through 44, we read this. A man from Baal Shalashah, say that for me. Shalisha. Baal Shalishah. That's what I say it's pronounced as, and you have to believe me because I'm up here. Came to a man of God with his sack full of 20 loaves of barley bread from the first bread of the harvest. Elisha said, give it to the people to eat. But Elisha's attendant asked, what? I'm going to set before 100 men these 20 loaves? Give it to the people to eat, Elisha said. For this is what the Lord says, they will eat and they will have some left over. So he set it before them, and as the Lord had promised, they ate and had some left over. Here we see God move in a simple yet miraculous way, and he turned 20 loaves of bread into enough to feed 100 people with leftovers. This was the first bread from the harvest, and this was a sign that God would continue to provide for his people. Number 3, leftovers are made to share a blessing. While leftovers are often a blessing for the family, most of the moms I know will snag anybody who drops by during a meal and make sure they take a plate home. A family member couldn't make it or was sick at home, well, the mother's going to make a plate and send that home too. In John 6, there is the most well-known of all of these stories this morning. And I'm going to read the whole thing. So follow with me. We're going to read verses 1 through 14. It says, after this, Jesus crossed the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias. A huge crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was performing by healing the sick. Jesus went up a mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, a Jewish festival, was near. So when Jesus looked up and noticed a huge crowd coming toward him, he asked Philip, where will we buy bread so that these people can eat? Now he asked this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. And Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread wouldn't be enough for each of them to have a little. So let's pause real quick. For the record, 200 denarii was roughly equivalent to 8 months of wages. So imagine how much bread you could buy with 8 months of paychecks, and it wouldn't even be enough for each of these 5,000 to have a slice. It's a lot of bread. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, so they sat down. The men numbered about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, and after giving thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also with the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were full, not fed, full, he told his disciples, collect the leftovers so that nothing is wasted. So they collected them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves that were left over from those who had eaten. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this truly is the prophet who has come into the world. The Bible doesn't tell us what the disciples did with those 12 baskets of leftovers, but I doubt that they each kept the basket for themselves. This bread was likely given away to those who were hungry. And more than bread, these 5,000 people saw this miracle of Jesus and took what they saw to share the message with others. This simple miracle of being fed with so little to the point where you are full was enough for them to realize this was the Messiah. And they went and they told that story. And actually, the number was likely closer to 15,000, maybe 20,000. Because again, this only recorded the men in attendance, not the women and the children. So one meal, 15,000 plus full bellies, and 12 full baskets left over. Leftovers are made with specific people in mind to show the cook's provision and to share a blessing. So, what do we take from this? These stories built upon the idea of God providing for us in a dramatic, exponential way. This is not just manna in the wilderness, enough sustenance for one day at a time. These are miracles of abundance. The presence of leftovers is a promise that God isn't done with us yet. There will be food and nourishment for another day. In fact, when most of us know that there are leftovers in the fridge, we might even look forward to it. Leftovers, in a theological sense, build our anticipation of a continued relationship with God. Such stories remind us of the overwhelming generosity of God. Stories like these feeding tales encourage us to remember that even when we marvel in God's goodness and blessings, they are only a small glimpse of what God is capable of in our lives. God is always bigger than our experiences, even our imaginations. Our God is indeed limitless. It's as if we get to the end of an amazing deal or offer, and then we hear this tagline, and I want you to say it with me, but wait, Beautiful. Today, food is so plentiful that we rarely think about how we're going to use it, what's going to get thrown away. But for much of the world now, but more specifically, much of history and this time, food is a lot more of a precious commodity. In many cultures, if a family had leftovers from a meal, which wasn't often, they would make sure to give the leftovers to people who were poor and didn't have much food to eat. Since food wasn't as plentiful or easy to get, it was important to share it so as many people as possible could be fed. And maybe that is what Jesus had in mind here, to take those baskets of food that were left over and give them to those in need. We don't really know, but we can see that in the text it was important to Jesus that nothing be wasted. When the Israelites were wandering in the desert, God provided manna from heaven to feed them. But it was more than just food. It was a way to teach the people that they were to depend on God to provide. The manna God provided was not to be saved overnight. If somebody did, it would spoil and not be usable the next day. God provided all they would need for that day, but each day was a new day to rely on God's gracious providence. When Jesus faced the devil in the wilderness, a similar idea came up. Jesus was hungry from his fasting, and the devil said, "Why don't you turn these stones into bread?" And what the devil was saying is, Jesus, don't worry about the world. Just feed your own immediate hunger. Or with the other temptations, the devil was saying to take the easy way out and have the people of Israel, and then, by extension, you and me, depend on God only as a bread king, one who only fulfills my desires, but not what I really need. In this miracle of feeding the 5,000, Jesus is not only saying God provides for all of our needs, but he is also showing how we are to respond to God's gracious giving. Give it away ourselves. What do we do with the leftovers? We give it away to the world. Now, this is an example that Jesus gave to us. Paul tells us in Philippians 2 that Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he humbled himself and became obedient, led the perfect life for us under submission to his Father in heaven, and suffered and died for us so that we could have rescue and release from our sin. Jesus gave more than leftovers to us. He gave his all. And now he asks us to do the same. And there is a miracle that happens in our lives when we share, even those things that we feel are just leftovers. God multiplies our giving. We think we have only 5 small loaves and 2 fish that can't even supply our own needs. But in faith, when we give the love of Jesus to others, God richly multiplies our little resources, and each person we give to is satisfied with the living bread of heaven, Jesus. And when we keep it to ourselves, it dwindles. It may even spoil. But when we share it, a miracle takes place, and God multiplies his love and grace 100-fold. I was reading the story of feeding the 5,000 to my boys a couple months ago. And honestly, before reading it in that moment, the idea of why were there leftovers had never crossed my mind. I sat there and I thought, why didn't Jesus just make exactly the amount needed? Did he overcompensate by accident? Did he make a mistake? Of course not. This showed how he not only met the immediate need, but the leftovers likely met needs of more people beyond the immediate. Jesus did exactly as he intended. So what do you do with the leftovers? Give them away and watch the power of God work a miracle in others' lives as he has worked in your own. Mothers, you might not even have known just how big of a blessing leftovers could be. But making more than you need for a meal is a provision of love for your family, and the leftovers spread that blessing further. But more to the point, God has given us more than we need. And I'm not just talking about money or material stuff. I'm not talking about the inconsequential. I am talking about the blessings of our daily lives that we may see as minor, but are actually an abundance of God's love that we're taking for granted. Even at bare minimum in our lives, we have an abundance of the assurance of salvation in Jesus Christ. And there is plenty left over for us to share in love with those around us. Let that be your goal each day. Give away some leftover joy, some leftover love, some leftover kindness, some leftover change, some leftover food, whatever you have been blessed with extra of, let your cup overflow onto others. Find a way to bless someone with the leftovers.